Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to one more session, the afternoon session at the Veg Fest UK Online, December 12th, 13th event. And we are today, Sunday the 13th of December, really having a theme around animal rights. We've looked at introduction to animal rights, we've explored ethical veganism a bit. And today, at this session today, which is entitled loosely Animal Rights, What Went Wrong. We'll also be looking at what can go right, what has gone right. We'll be looking at, where we may go with some of this, what we can take, some of the lessons. Also having a bit of a, fun, in-depth conversation to perhaps inspire a few questions. In that note, you're very welcome to ask some questions if you're listening and you would like to ask some questions. We will be selecting them and putting them up on the banner so that our two guests will be able to answer along with myself. And on that note, I'd be very happy to introduce my two guests, Ronnie Lee and Roger Yates. Ronnie and Roger kindly joining us. Ronnie, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Roger, goodness me. Is that you?
I see Roger's about to do a robbery.
Yeah, Ronnie, if you remember, we did a podcast series together, and I said you went vegan in 1972, so you're very old. So you must obviously be in the really, the kind of bracket that's really in danger. So I thought I'd better wear this,
I think he's still on the run from 1989, isn't it?
Probably is,
yeah.
On that note, you will see that eagle-eyed viewers, or perhaps I shouldn't say eagle-eyed, but whatever, people with a sharp notice on my dress sense will recognise that I'm typically wearing a shirt in solidarity with my two guests. People will note this is reminiscent of an HMP prison shirt, which is in fact not a prison shirt. It is a duff of St George. But back in the 80s, I remember I did a 3 in Armley. 3 days, fortunately. It was a long weekend after getting arrested at Nostra Priory. But, both of you did actually do quite a long sentence, Ronnie. I remember you went to prison mid-80s, was it? And did a long time.
Yeah, well, I was in prison, first of all, in the mid-70s, in 1974 and then 1975. Again, in the late 70s, and my big prison sentence was in the mid-80s, where one of the prisons I was in was Armley, actually, for a little bit longer than the weekend, and it is the most awful place, or it was then.
Put me off for life, I've got to say. It's a dreadful place.
Yeah, I was in Armley. I think Ronnie went to prison 3 times because he couldn't get fed at home.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, I used to just break a window to be locked away.
Actually, funny enough, there were some people who did that. Like they were a bit institutionalized and they couldn't cope on the outside. So around Christmas time, they would smash a window so they go back in.
Yeah, they did. I knew a few guys like that. Very sad. Yes, that is absolutely true. But they time it so they'd be let out again in the spring. They bank on getting a sentence of that length, so they'd be released when the weather was nice again.
Well, I won't bore you with my prison stories because, except to say that I was banged up with somebody who had not seen Christmas since 1969, but had never done more than 6 months. They sort of fitted into that, and that was in 1984, so that's a long time ago. But I think, if you look at this, we joke about this, but in some respects, this was a big part of what went wrong. In some respects, I might put forward that animal rights became a criminal kind of, a criminality got attached to it, which I would say is unjust because, if you think about what we're doing, which is trying to liberate animals or release animals from this appalling state that we have, it's not really fair. But would you say that was part of what happened in the 80s? Is that a fair reflection?
basically it was kind of really came as a result of the way that people approached campaigning. I think because the idea was there was this kind of sense of campaigning against the people that oppressed animals, and so the idea was to actually, force people out of business, force places to close down. I mean, that was the kind of really very much the ethos of the ALF at the time, and so that sort of led to that really because the idea of the Animal Liberation Front really. As well as rescuing animals, a lot of animals were rescued, but the main idea really was to cause economic loss to businesses that were involved in animal oppression, to actually force them to stop. And so in doing that, people became involved in activities that were against the law, and those people ended up being arrested and put in prison, really in large numbers. I mean, there was at one stage there were kind of, I think, several hundred ALF activists in prison at the same time. So it was kind of the approach to campaigning that led to that, I think.
I think it's fair to say, I mean, Roger, you were, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ronnie, you helped found the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, or indeed were the founder. And Roger, you were the press, you do the media, I think. And is it fair to say that the media really jumped on some of those aspects and sort of blew them up and turned a lot of public opinion against rights?
Not just the media, but the movement as well, in the sense that things did change. I mean, first of all, what we've got to say from a kind of critical criminological point of view, if you like, is that the criminalization of acts is very political and ideological. And so some of the things that you get arrested for and put in prison for are kind of not as bad and are quite moral acts compared with some of the other things that kind of go on. So there is that. And then we had the issue, as Ronnie said, that there was a lot of other animals being rescued, and that was very popular with the press. The iconic picture of an activist in a balaclava holding a beagle as they came out of a laboratory, for example, that was very popular. And then the homes dried up to some degree. And so the activists turned to what they call economic sabotage, which was damaging stuff in order to take the profit away from, the animal use industries. And so once you started doing that, the media could then start labeling you as vandals, and even it got to the stage where they were saying things like terrorists and stuff. And so that started to happen. And a lot of the moderate groups felt very under stress to join in, really, because they had to keep their respectable image. And so there's a lot of kind of into kind of movement politics going on as well, to be honest.
I mean, I remember this because at my time I was promoting veganism. I was vegan in 1984, and a whole kind of ethos at that time of promoting veganism. I said I don't remember many other people being vegan, but those that were, it was just about having fun. It was about inviting people to have some food. Very much a sort of plant-based diet. Let's get a foot in the door. Celebrate, food and music and culture and such like. And just the fact that you were vegan was a big statement. That was a huge statement. It's like, oh no, we got, especially if you're eating communally. I remember traveling in the 80s. I remember being with the Mutual Waste Company. We always used to eat. We were out in Holland, actually, interested at the time. We always used to eat like 20, 30 of us communally because that's the only way we could survive. There's always a vegan in the house. So, the sort of default was that the chef would always have to create a vegan meal. And that would quite often be the one that the people would gravitate towards anyway. Because, so this was our sort of trick, really. They were very different from the animal rights and Animal Liberation Front sort of tactics of property and liberation.
It brings up a movement thing that Ronnie spoke about a lot of the times, which is back in those days, we didn't really campaign for veganism. That wasn't part of the deal. It was campaigning for animal liberation, animal rights, those kind of terms. and even in relation to who, in terms of organizations, who you would think were part of the animal rights movement was very kind of confused in those days. You know, we had Compassion in World Farming in the animal rights movement and the League Against Cruel Sports in the animal rights movement, but the Vegan Society was just seen as the food group, as you suggested. And Ronnie often tells a story that when you went vegan, most of the people running most of the groups were flesh consumers, Ronnie, right?
Yes, right. They were. I mean, prior to the 1970s, what you had was national organisations that campaigned on a variety of issues: the League Against Cruel Sports, National Anti-Vivisection Society, etc. And invariably, that those groups were run by meat eaters, and basically they're very centralised. They didn't encourage their members to be active. They just wanted. Basically, the most they encouraged anyone to do is write a letter to their MP, and to send money into the central organisation. And then that sort of changed in the 70s with the rise of the concept of animal rights and people becoming involved at grassroots level. But the kind of ethos of kind of campaigning on those particular issues continued. So the campaigns continued against the same things, and increasingly the people campaigning were vegan, and even a lot, if not all, of these organisations were kind of taken over by vegans, and the people running them were vegans. But there was no campaigning for veganism, no campaign, and any real campaigning for veganism, concerted campaigning for veganism, has kind of probably only gone on for 20, perhaps 25 years. It's really, vegan campaigning is a really recent thing.
It is. I mean, it's interesting, talking to newer vegans, they're a little bit shocked really, because the kind of movement they've come into was radically different from the kind of movement that Ronnie and I came into, where it was single issue. Veganism wasn't kind of hardly talked about. I always give like you say, I was a Northern Press officer, and so I did a lot of radio. I did a bit of TV. I did a lot of radio, and we were kind of getting 2 or 3 kind of radio things every week. And I mean, Ronnie asked me to be the Northern contact because Ronnie was too busy. He was just getting too much work, and so we were doing all that. But I don't remember talking about veganism on the radio. The journalists didn't ask us about veganism, and we didn't say anything about veganism, And so nowadays, of course, the first question probably from a journalist would be about veganism, or at least if not, the first answer would be about veganism. But it just what didn't happen back then, and it's kind of like the new vegans kind of go, well, how did that work? Which it's quite an interesting kind of thing. I think it's fair to say.
Sorry, I was going to say it was kind of radical, but not radical. In other words, the kind of there was part of it that was radical in terms of that there was kind of more like grassroots activity, and that there were actions taking place instead of it all being centralised with national organisations. It was radical in that sense, but it wasn't radical in the sense that the objectives became more radical. The objectives were still these single issue campaigns, rather than the overall campaign against speciesism as such, against human supremacism as such, which is more what's going on at the moment with the promotion of veganism. And now that type of campaigning is actually far more radical than the campaigning we did way back then.
It's also got a different focus, doesn't it? You mentioned the single issue campaigns, and I recall a really distinct difference, and it's obviously a generalisation, but the animal rights campaigning in the 80s was really focused specifically on vivisection. And that was the real focus. This was the real common thread. and veganism was separate, really. You had animal rights people who weren't vegan, but very clear about vivisection. And then you had vegan people who weren't animal rights, who were really clear about plant-based diets, but not necessarily so clear about other aspects of animal use and exploitation. And so it seems to me, in a way, if we look at perhaps what went wrong in the 80s, and it's a bit harsh to say what went wrong, or perhaps what wasn't right, or what could be going right, was that I think there was a sort of separation of two movements in a way. And they grew, but they didn't always grow that comfortably. And perhaps that's why we saw some conflict. And the bit that I just want to come on to, which I think is relevant, is there became a point where this became a weaponized position. And I think we still see the strands of this today. We were talking about this a bit earlier, about how, ethical veganism has been weaponized and can be used against, perhaps we might have, make an idea about it. Somebody who's vegetarian or just beginning to get into plant-based diets and understand this. And this position, or somebody who has been vegan, but hasn't really understood that whole vegan philosophy or position, or hasn't really looked at it, or inquired about it, but is still living what they consider to be, most people would agree, is pretty much vegan. Obviously, there's some clear definitions, but I think, is it fair to say that, part of the issue is a weaponization of this position? Roger, I know you've got something to say about that. I'll ask Ronnie first. What do you think about that, Ronnie?
Yes, see, well, I mean, kind of going back to what you said earlier, it wasn't that people really campaigning on, what's referred to as single issues weren't vegan. I mean, some weren't vegan, but increasingly they kind of did become vegan. I mean, I was very involved in hunt saboteurs in the 1970s. We had a group in North London that was run by myself and another couple of people. We were vegan. Invariably, when people joined, they weren't vegan, and they'd say, "Oh, we're not interested in veganism. We just want to go out and save the fox." But within 2 or 3 weeks, most of them had become vegan through just talking to us and us explaining what veganism was all about. But nevertheless, and that tended to be the case throughout the movement. That people kind of became involved as activists, and then got veganized by other activists. And so we ended up really with a movement where the vast majority of people were vegan, but nobody campaigned for veganism, and that was the people that kind of were just into promoting veganism, perhaps. I mean, that would be at that time really a very small number that would actively promote veganism, but they kind of weren't looked at in the same light, really, because our focus was actually was directly aimed at combating the people that oppress animals. The public were on the sidelines. The public weren't involved in that. We didn't make any effort to educate ordinary people, and it didn't matter to us in a sense that that people didn't like us. It didn't really matter to us too much. So
well, that's useful.
Roger, that is really interesting. Because we are, I think we're now at a position, especially with this book, and with the proliferation of plant-based diets, the whole. I mean, have you seen the report today? Supermarkets are saying Christmas vegan options are up 700%, and 80% increase in searching for vegan cheeses, and this, that, and the other. I mean, the plant-based lifestyle in the mainstream, we're thrilled about that. But also ethical veganism has been written about, it's been published, it's been accepted in law, that we see the similarities and the distinction. So I kind of feel like, in many respects we got there, but it was a long journey. And what you just said there about how, well, it was such a campaign focus rather than a sort of, let's get all the people involved and get them to perhaps engage with this. Those words, you didn't like people, is a key issue. You didn't really want people. You didn't care if people liked you. So that's different. That's a subtle difference, but I think it's
although we did have the press office, and the idea of the press office was to explain to the public why the person or the activist group had done it. So it was, I mean, one of the main things that attracted me in the end to be one of the press officers, because I resisted it for a couple of years, was the fact I realized that, you know, the ALF were like punching a hole through the issue and creating a lot, you know, it was the hook that the media could hang a story on. This is pre-internet, we've got to remember. So you were kind of dependent on the mass media, which itself is a problem. But there's a certain complexity here. I mean, like my friend Bernie Wright, she co-founded the Alliance for Animal Rights in Ireland back in the 80s. Her attitude is, well, you just do campaigns, and in terms of going vegan, that's just what individuals do. It's just like it kind of clicks, you know. It's all kind of like, you know, all the dots get connected, and you think, okay, I'm not going to start. I'm going to stop, you know, consuming other animals, etc., etc., and then you move on to all the other aspects of it. But in terms of the, if you look at it from a kind of social movement theory issue, it's quite complex. For example, some people would talk about the feminist movement, about being, you know, you've got liberal feminists, radical feminists, separatist feminists, black feminists, difference feminists, all kind of feminists, but they could all be called part of the overarching kind of feminist movement. So it used to be thought, I think, that, you know, a lot of things fed into what was in those days called the animal protection movement. That was the kind of language that was used in those days. People like Robert Garner would talk about that in books. And so that would be animal rights, animal welfare, animal liberation, veganism. But it was kind of like this multi-movement idea that you mentioned, Tim, that it all kind of was there all together in the same movement, but in a very kind of disconnected kind of way. And then you've got, you know, the national groups and the grassroots. And you know, you got the regional groups, you know, you had the NAL and people like that. There was a lot of stuff kind of going on in terms of action. It was also the start of things like, you know, the large marches, you know, 15,000 people going to a laboratory and that kind of stuff. Again, back in the 80s, big fly posting campaigns. So there was a lot of action on all kinds of fronts, and it all seemed to kind of fit within one movement. But in reality, it was more like the multi-movement idea that you talked about, Tim. You know, the fact that all these things kind of live together in a very confused kind of way. But, you know, in terms of the beginning of the vegan movement, that was pretty ethical right from the start. And then you've got this issue that, well, where did that go? You know, and you know, it's interesting because, like, in our first session, you mentioned Arthur Ling. And Arthur Ling wanted to professionalize the movement for loads of good reasons. But part of the professionalization of a social movement means that it tends to moderate. So the Vegan Society tended to moderate. And so now you've got the kind of fairly wishy-washy definition that we use and all this kind of stuff, which is not as good as some of the statements from the 1940s and 50s. And so there's been a moderation that's gone on, ironically, from a kind of radical start. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether we've got back to ethical veganism, because there seems to be a lot of arguments within the vegan community about what veganism is, what we stand for, and how pragmatic we should be, how abolitionist we should be, how honest we should be. I see all that kind of discourse carrying on. You know, I'm sure everybody here must see that. You know.
Well, yeah, there is a discourse. I mean, it reminds me of the words of Tom Reagan, which I will now completely mishmash and paraphrase incorrectly. But that Tom Reagan did say, you know, that the animal rights is a complex issue, and that let all tongues speak, let all voices be heard. And you know, we'll get there. It will take some time. We've got to work through a lot of stuff. And almost at this point, we are looking back at a whole 4 or 5 decades of which people are still alive. The history is still alive, ourselves included. But we're also looking forward to a number of decades where we've got to take on these ideas and make sure they really become established. I think just going to come back to this point because I think it's important, because I think part of the issue is the leadership, or should I say lack of leadership. Certainly if you think about, well, I will name two people. I mean, the two Garys, Francione and Yaruski, both have had, big impacts on this movement, but both have had some very, very challenging, personality.
You told us not to swear, Tim.
Aspects. But I would say it's very encouraging. I think we're seeing a more diverse movement. One of the issues you could say about the last 50 years is it has been largely white men with a Western viewpoint leading or being influential in this movement. I'm sure we will see what we're already seeing is more women, more people of color, more different diversity, marginalized groups coming through, having more say, more leadership. We're seeing this already, which is fantastic. And I do think that was part of the problem. If we look at what went wrong, it was poor leadership.
It's complicated. This is complicated as well. I did a vlog entry about this, because if you think back to the 1970s and 80s, leaders in sociology are usually called prime movers. There was a hell of a lot of female prime movers back then. You talk about Ingrid Newkirk, Jean Pink, Margaret Manzoni, Paddy Broughton, Bernie Wright, all the people in the grassroots movement, Serena Rowlands, Fiona Hughes. I mean, we could name loads of them who were in a kind of what you would call a leadership position. So it's not as clear as that. It's a bit more clear when you look at, the representation of Black persons, people of color. We've struggled to recruit people of different ethnicities into the movement, and that's true. And of course, we are criticized for that, which is fair. How exactly you resolve that problem, which nobody wants, it's not as though anybody created it on purpose. How you resolve it is very unclear, because I mean, Ronnie was saying overnight, we've got like an open door policy. It's not as though we refuse people. It's just that they don't come from certain things. Then you've got the issue of like what went wrong. Then you can think about things like Peter and the racism and sexism involved with that type of campaigning. Did that kind of provide a block to entry into the movement, because people thought, I don't want to get involved with that movement for all kinds of reasons?
Well, let's ask Ronnie about that. Ronnie, what do you think? If we bring Ronnie back in, thank you for listening in there. And slight tech problems there, but just Ronnie, I mean, you saw all this campaigning. I mean, do you think, some of this, what Roger's referred to there, has that been a block? Do you think, if you think of the Peter, some of the sexist campaigns, especially, and, I mean, the 80s and the 90s, that was really, that was like the kind of, that was the public image of animal rights, often campaigned in the mainstream. How damaging was that, do you think?
Well, certainly, I think it hasn't helped at all. Some of the campaigns that Peter have run involving those things haven't helped. But I think there's more to it than that. I think there really is more to it than just that, as to why there is a lack of involvement of people of colour. I mean, there have been some very good activists. People of colour have been activists, for instance. That it hasn't been without the movement hasn't been without those people. But when come back to the idea of leadership and leaders. I mean, in a sense, I think what we need are more leaders. What we need are a lot more leaders. But what we need are those leaders to operate at a local level, rather than kind of speaking from on high with all these adoring followers that you get in the case of, seems to be in the case of some of the YouTube celebs. We need a lot more local leadership at grassroots level, and by leaders I mean people who organise and instigate actions locally. That's kind of what we need all over the place if we're going to properly spread the vegan message and really change society so that we eventually achieve animal liberation. And I think it's the question of leadership. It's still being probably too centralized. I mean, I talked about the old days when you had these national organizations, very centralized and no real grassroots movement. In a sense, we've kind of, in many ways still got the same thing today, but in a different way. You've still got national organizations, of course, but then you've got other people that are kind of, sort of these centralized leadership figures. And what we need is a decentralization of leadership and leadership all over the place if we're going to have the required amount of activity to properly properly educate people.
Well, that's really interesting. I know you're both strong advocates of grassroots, and you've both been vocal in the previous about the disparity of funding and the lack of funding from for certain aspects. I mean, I've seen, perhaps, I don't know, I would say I've got some good things to say about the Nationals that I'm not sure we would perhaps go into now, that sort of area. I think the Nationals have played a huge part. I'm a big fan of the Nationals, as you know, but also but there has been, the grassroots these days is very much based around cubes and save movements, and there is, and Hunt Sabs have seemed to have taken a real rise in interest recently.
Are the cubes grassroots, though?
Say?
Are the cubes a grassroots thing?
Well, because they're people, basically, in the cubes, you can do this. This is going off all over the place, all over the world. There's people with just a laptop getting up and doing this kind of advocacy with no central funding, no rules, there's different factions and groups within them, but there's nothing.
There's a great deal of rules. It's easy to get thrown out of these mobilizations if you don't follow the rules or even wear the uniform and stuff. So it's I'm not quite sure. That certainly wouldn't be the model that Ronnie and I would favor, because it's kind of like you've got these cubes with a few kind of privileged people who organize them, and they're supported from a kind of central kind of location, which is getting millions of dollars. Now, all of that is a bit of a mystery to me. I've got to admit, what we're looking for, I think, in terms of grassroots development, would just be, and it's not all to do with funding, but funding helps, would just be to encourage people to organize on their own bat. So one day they might do a cube, then one day they might do a save, one day they might go sabbing, one day they might organize a march, one day, they might do tables, a little bit more kind of laissez-faire in that sense. And I think that would develop the movement from my point of view, because I think Ronnie's right that we've just got an activist version of centralization now, which is kind of come on top as a layer on top of the national groups. And as you say, we won't necessarily engage in that debate because we don't necessarily agree on that. But it's certainly, if we're looking at what went wrong and how to get over it, what we need to do is empower the grassroots. And I'm not sure the cubes system is the way to do it, because I don't really understand it, where you need somebody in Australia to tell people in Bristol to stand in a cube with laptops. I don't understand that.
Well, yeah, we don't either. We certainly agree on that one, Roger. Famed, actually, we're both in the annals of history for dealing with that issue, indeed, in the summer last summer. But that aside, I think, and Ronnie, I know you have. One of the things you've done, actually put forward, I think a few years ago, was a proposition that we should actually redefine veganism to include just that very issue we're talking about, which is activism and campaigning. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, your premise is that we don't just have a moral obligation to not use animals, we have a moral obligation to campaign on their behalf. Is that, have I summarised correctly there in that position? Ronnie?
Yes. Yes, I think that it's kind of not it's not enough just to be vegan in the sense of avoiding animal products and avoiding involvement or doing one's best to avoid involvement in animal oppression, because the problem is that lots of other people are still doing those things. And so if we're going to, really properly change things for animals and bring about animal liberation, we have to become active in spreading the vegan message. We have to become active in educating others to become vegan. Otherwise, our net effect on animals remains negative, because what we have to remember is all of us kind of have a negative effect on animals, even on other animals, even if we are vegan. We live in a society which exerts through our lifestyles in kind of our Western society. We exert tremendous pressure upon the earth. We're huge consumers of the earth's resources, and destroyers of the natural world, just through the lifestyle that kind of we live within the system that operates, in our countries. And so we have to take that into account, that really even on a if we adopt a vegan diet, of course that negative impact on other animals does become considerably reduced, but it doesn't disappear. And so if we're going to have say that we had an actual positive impact in terms of other animals, the only way we can do that is through actually educating other people to become vegan. That's the only way we can be sure that we've actually, our presence on the earth has actually been something that was positive in terms of other animals. So I'd like people to kind of think about that. People who are listening to this and who are, are just vegan in the sense that they're just avoiding things, avoiding involvement in animal oppression and avoiding consuming animal products. I'd like everyone to think about how can I be active in spreading the vegan message, and that doesn't have to be anything that would be particularly stressful or that would lead them into any kind of problems. I mean, there are some people that want to kind of do what might be classed as the sort of more militant type of actions, but you don't have to. Just handing out a leaflet or putting a leaflet through someone's letterboxes, or leaving leaflets in books in a library, or helping at an information stall. All these things are helping to spread the message, and these are things that pretty much, even writing a letter to your local paper advocating veganism, all these things add up, and people can be activists in all these ways. And that's what I would encourage everyone to do. If everyone who considers themselves vegan becomes an actual vegan activist in whatever way they can, then we can really get somewhere, because we've got the numbers. You see, the people that want to promote the oppression of other animals and making money out of it, and want people to continue consuming animal products and want to continue with the destruction of the natural world, for instance. Those people have got the money at the moment. They've got the political power. What we've got is the numbers. And if those numbers can be used properly to spread our message, then we can actually win. But it does demand the involvement of a lot more people who consider themselves vegan than we have at present. And I think what's important is going back to talking about activism, and I think it's important that activism is focused on a local area, and I think kind of, one of the problems. I mean, I don't look at Cubes, and I don't look at national organisations, really in a total negative way. I think there has been positivity from those things, but I think there's a sense in which say Cubes can be criticised because they tend to take place in the centre of large cities. They attract people from kind of all the surrounding area, when those people could be organising activities in their own local area where they actually live. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. More activists, becoming organisers and becoming organisers locally. Because if you look at you look at all the towns and cities, in the UK, indeed throughout the world, most of them, apart from the large cities, don't have activist vegan groups. They're very much focused in big cities, but people don't just live in big cities, and they don't just people don't just operate in the centre of big cities when they're going shopping. People are everywhere in all towns and suburbs of cities, in villages. We need to take our activism to all those places, and that means the involvement of a lot more vegans in doing that.
Hey, I think it's very, very, very critical point for us. We've got a foothold, and we could really bring impetus by raising our game. There's so many ways of getting active. There is a question about that, actually, which I think we're going to come up with, which probably be for Ronnie to answer if you want. But there is, I think one of the things that's gone wrong, and I'm just going to refer back to this because that's the title of this thing, is that I think activists generally have come in for a lot of criticism at times. And I think the level of critique has improved a lot. There's a lot better level of critique and discussion in a lot of areas. There's areas where this isn't so, areas where there is. But I think the importance of having good discourse and good informed debate and discussions about these, about the best way to be active, or whether we should be doing this, or whether that would be better, or, part of the problem, I think, is that the criticism for activists has been really harsh, really, really harsh. And I've seen the most appalling treatment of activists at times, which is not surprising that people sometimes are put off the whole idea of getting active. So I think there's one thing that's really important, is to keep looking to get that good discourse. This is why, again, I just refer to this book. It's a great starting page, to be on the same page, and then expand from there and have debates. And one of the things I've always enjoyed, Roger, with you, particularly over the last 5 years, is we are pretty much on the same page. And the times that we've disagreed have been the constructive times, actually. I think that's times where quite often we learn when we do disagree. It's, if you've got a lot in common, it's the bits that you disagree with that are quite interesting to look at. But I think if we look at what's gone wrong in the past sometimes, and what stopped people maybe getting more active, is it could be a lonely place. It could be a very lonely place. And perhaps that's also why people get a bit tribal and defensive about their form of activism, because they find more than just an outlet for their activism. They find a home, they find a solidarity, and much like yourselves, they find a sort of belonging. And I think that's also a really important aspect of people. This encourages people to campaign when they feel belonging to something. I think that's partly why the Cubes have been successful. I see, you mentioned us in Bristol, Roger. I see that there's a group of people who enjoy each other's company and want to belong and want to be part of something and do something positive and share that. And that's a very powerful mover, I'm sure, in social aspects. So if we can keep improving the discourse and keep improving the way we communicate to people, have some kindness and some supportive discourse rather than the weaponizing of it, I think that will help not only clarity, but also to encourage people to engage more, and also to give them the right answers. Roger, we talked with Nella this morning about how Nella felt empowered by reading Tom Regan, understanding the rights issue, applying that to her own advocacy, and finding how that strengthened and give her more confidence to get out and do more of that work. So it's a really interesting one. I don't know if we got this question to come up. There's a question from Alwyn Cartmell, just asking, education is a winner. How can I be active? A good starting place. So Ronnie, I'll ask you that first, and then Roger, I'll ask you, perhaps fairly briefly, because we're coming up to about, well, we try and get a few more questions. But yeah, how about, what would you recommend on that one?
Well, first of all, hi, Alwyn. Alwyn's, I regard Alwyn as a good friend, and it's great that she's listening in. Basically, how does someone get active in a local area? Because that's kind of what I think is important. I think, like, if there are things that lots of things people can do just on their own. I mean, delivering leaflets through letterboxes, leaving them in public places, on public transport, those sort of things. Anyone can do that just on their own. But if you're involved in a group, you can do a lot more things. You can kind of do street stalls, for instance. Hopefully, the time will come soon again when we can do those properly. Stalls at various community events, those type of things, where you need more people. And really, if there's wherever someone is, there are going to be other vegans, and some of those vegans are going to be prepared to be active if the activism is organised. So I would say, in order to get a group started, find someone else locally who's a vegan, get together with them, discuss, what can we do together. Two people can do a lot of things. Two people can run a stall. Things like approach your local libraries. Earlier this year, our local vegan group, we had two of our local libraries allowed us to do veganuary stalls in the libraries, for instance. There's all sorts of stuff that you can kind of do locally. Make contacts with your local groups that are involved in environmental matters, because obviously, a plant diet is a very important way of protecting the planet. They'll maybe be organising events where you can do stalls. There's there's really all sorts you can do, and don't think straight away that you've got to go straight in and do stuff that's complicated, do stuff that's stressful. Some very, very simple actions, just as I said, just to say, delivering leaflets, for instance, that very, very simple actions can be very important in spreading the message.
Absolutely. Roger, what would you input? I know you do the VIP, you are out there, as you are indeed, Ronnie, doing street stalls, you're out there doing this, you do walk and talk, as it were. But Roger, I know you're a big fan of the street work, but what else?
Yeah, I mean, I'd endorse everything that Ronnie said, and I like the idea of the kind of vegan fairs in the local hall and that kind of thing, because that could only just be a matter of 7 or 8 stalls, which will be there already to organise, a little bit like they used to organise jumble sales and that kind of stuff. So all of that, I mean, it's interesting because we've got a very kind of vibrant thing going on in Dublin. There's lots of groups doing lots of different things. So there's something for everybody to get involved in. What's interesting, though, is what's not happening is that Ronnie was saying, well, people come in from all over into Dublin. Well, that's true. What really we need is for them to stay where they are and do stuff from where they would come in from, and to really expand, which is why Declan Bowen's group called Vigo, it was called Vegan Education on the Go, and he wanted to encourage people to set up in their own locality rather than coming into Dublin. So that's the kind of next step. That's something where a bit of funding would kind of help. But I would I would agree with what Ronnie said, and I also, in terms of Alwyn's thing, education is the winner. Well, obviously, education is key to it all. That's what Tom Regan also said. It's educate, and all this kind of stuff. And before we go though, Tim, there is something I want to say, going right back to the question. So, I mean, we can continue with this, or I could say that now, whatever you like. It's just that I want to say something which I think is very important about the issue of animal rights, what went wrong.
Well, hold that point, because I'd like to come to it, but I just think, because we've got Alwyn's question, I just wanted to round that up to say that I think, apart from agreeing with you both about the importance of education, about getting active, and honestly reminding ourselves that there are multiple ways. An interesting point that Lynn Sawyer made when she was with us last month talking about a panel we were talking about. We were talking about animal rights and wildlife, actually. And Lynn made a point about the support work. You can do support work for people. So you can be very passive in your activity. You can be very supportive, perhaps just offering to look after somebody's dogs or something whilst they're out sabbing or protected badgers or something was the point made, and that support work, and I know a lot of that goes on. I mean, we've got friends of ours who are vegan food banks. They're doing this work. There's so many ways of doing this. The people who do the Art of Compassion project springs to mind, raising money for animal sanctuaries and such like through that artwork. There's so many ways, of integrating. I've come a lot more to your position, Ronnie, about where I understand that. Perhaps that's just a sign of experience. Perhaps recognising we've got less time ahead of us than when we were in our first flush of whatever, youth, etc., 30, 40, 50 years ago, is that, we haven't got so much time. But I think on a broader picture, we've got that planetary aspect, environmental catastrophes looming, and already seeing this, that they're sort of adding pressure to this. There is a, I know it's an old cliche, but imagine if, 80% of vegans raise their game by 10% during Veganuary. In a time when there's a lot of people who are open to this, they're seeing it, it's mainstream, it's going to be on, Good Morning Britain and goodness me, all over the place. If collectively we raised our game and just perhaps all put that extra hour or two in and encouragement wherever we felt, yes, collectively that could make huge impacts. And I think we should be looking at that, thinking about that, seeing if we can encourage that. So I think encouraging people to be active is a really important part of this, being encouraging and supportive. And showing some gratitude too. And on that note, thank you, anybody who's out there doing this work. Thank you, both of you, gentlemen, for giving your lives pretty much to this cause. Thank you to those who have died. Roger, there was somebody whose name escapes me, and you're going to remind me, and I'm going to be embarrassed because I can't remember their name, but they were a big part of getting all the vegan fairs off the ground. 15 years ago, they had a blueprint. There's
Neil Lee, yeah.
Neil, thank you for remembering Neil. Neil Lee gave, this huge input 15, 20 years ago. It is a really valuable thing, and I think, some more gratitude and appreciation and warmth and encouragement is key to this, being kind. And if you want to be critical, you shouldn't be shy, but you should also be kind and supportive and helpful with it.
Well, interesting thing about Neil Lee, of course, is I think Neil had spina bifida, didn't he?
Yeah.
And there's also a group, Ronnie remember this, a group run by someone called Susan or Sue, called DARE. I think it was Disabled for Animal Rights. So there is this issue about, white male able-bodied type critique. But, if you do look at the history, there's been all kinds of people. There's reasons why presumably they're not as active anymore. There's reasons why they don't do the kind of prominent stuff, I suppose. Not Lisa, some of them are not with us anymore, like Neil, for example, so there is that. Going back to what you were saying about the community thing, the social part, I used to be opposed to the social part of social movements, and I was wrong about it. It's very important, and I think that's where the cube thing is very good. All I would like to do is empower the cubes to think for themselves and think, okay, well, what do we want to do? What do we want to do as a cube? You don't have to be told what to do. What do you want to do? What do you want to wear? What shape do you want to be in? What laptops? What music do you decide? It's our movement. You don't have to be told what to do. And once you've decided to do that, then you can decide, well, what else do we want to do? And that's how the grassroots grows, by taking initiative, not being waiting for an order from someone. That bit is kind of counter-revolutionary, and we need to work on that for sure.
That was key to the 80s and indeed the 70s. Indeed, just a tune springing to mind, Eddie and the Hot Rods from 1977.
Yeah.
There you go. You see, look it up, kids at home, Eddie and the Hot Rods, and you'll see exactly what I'm on about. Number something in 1977. But it was about, and I really think we were talking about leaders earlier too. It's about that whole idea of you lead yourself, you learn, you lead yourself, and try and inspire other people around you to do that. And there's techniques of doing that, that are proven over time and more effective than others. But yeah, so look, we've been chatting now for the best part of an hour. So I think we're going too long. Roger, I know you did want to say something, key point. And then what I'm going to ask you to do both is to just think about one thing you think might have gone wrong, but one thing you think has been fixed, and then one thing that we really still need to attend to. So I'll ask you those to wrap.
Again, the easy ones first, Tim. Right, okay. So the thing
you say your piece first, Roger.
Yeah, the thing that I want to say is I want to make a plea for animal rights. And one thing that went wrong in the animal rights movement is that the idea of animal rights, embodied by Tom Reagan in particular, has been marginalized. We've got to admit and recognize and acknowledge that the rights-based position is not the dominant position in the animal movement and never has been. Now, what I would like is because it's an untried theory in an animal social movement sense, I suppose. But I'd like to try it. I'd like to be able to go to the public and go to journalists as an animal rights movement, talking about other animals being rights bearers, and that what we do to them are rights violations, which is not the claims making of this movement. The problem is this movement calls itself the animal rights movement, even though it talks the language of animal welfare. I think that we need to, this is such an ironic thing I'm about to say, we need to create space for animal rights within the animal rights movement. And it's never happened, really. There was a brief time around about 1990 in North America. Didn't really happen in Britain, although there was an appearance by Reagan around about 89 in Britain. That was influential. But by and large, the animal welfare movement has always squashed down the animal rights movement for a variety of reasons. And some of them people would think are valid. But the point is, there are some people who want to make animal rights the cornerstone of their claims making. The problem is it's difficult to do it when you've got everybody else calling themselves animal rights, regardless of whether they know anything about animal rights at all. And of course, there are some people who oppose animal rights, which is fair enough. It's just that I'd like to actually be able to create a space for animal rights within animal rights, which I know sounds a bit weird, but I've always advocated for that. I'd love to see that just as an experiment, if you like.
I agree. I think it's really valid. We should have an animal rights movement that's just based on animal rights, and I think we should simplify it.
We've never had one, though. You see, that's a point.
Not and base ourselves on that. But that's the beauty about being on the same page. So just to wrap up then with this, I'm just going to repeat that. So, Ronnie, I know you've been thinking the answers to this. What we'd like to say, I've been jotting down a couple because I only made it up a minute ago. Roger, you've got a few minutes to think. But Ronnie, if you can think of just one thing that really went wrong, one thing that we've really put right, and one thing that we really need to address in a fairly succinct, so people can take away a bit of clarity there, what would you say?
I think the thing that went wrong was that for a long time we kind of ignored the public. As I said, that we were focused on those that oppressed animals, and the public were on the sidelines. And so for a long time we didn't concentrate on spreading veganism amongst the public. And I think this is kind of something that's it's not kind of just a problem with with the animal liberation movement. It's a problem with like kind of the whole of the left in the way, because I regard our movement as as part of the left, in that we've concentrated too much on protest and not enough on education. And so we've got a situation now where people are voting in characters like Donald Trump, where people are voting in characters like Boris Johnson, because those people haven't been educated to change their attitudes and the way they think. And that's a failure of education, or a failure to educate. And that's kind of the same thing kind of happened with veganism. I think if vegan outreach had started a lot earlier than it did, we'd be further along the road to animal liberation now. The thing we put right is that vegan outreach has actually started, has taken off. It's become probably the main type of activity amongst animal rights campaigners, animal liberationists. And the thing we can do better, and what we should be doing, is what I've said already. We need more of it. We need this to happen right down in local areas, right down in local communities, with a lot more people organising stuff. So it's kind of all the same thing, really. It didn't happen soon. It didn't happen soon enough, and then it did happen, but it's still not happening enough.
No, well, that's really clear. I think that's a really good, really clear piece. And it's just so interesting because we kind of come from the same page, but also over that period. As I mentioned, I came from promoting veganism, and I felt animal rights held us back a bit. But then I come through veganism, and I understand the lack of understanding of animal rights was holding us back a bit too. So it's interesting that it sort of come together and merged. Roger, what would you say about that? What went wrong? What have we put right? And where do we need to attend to? What still needs to be done?
Okay, well, I'd endorse everything that Ronnie just said. I think what went wrong is that we allowed a power elite to emerge in the movement. And the power elite has created power centers where all the finances are drawn into themselves and away from the grassroots, which need to be empowered. So I think careerism is a complicated issue, and I acknowledge that straight away. But I think careerism is a problem within a social movement, and social movement theory suggests that very same thing. So I think that's one thing that we've gone wrong. When, to the extent that we ever did it, the fact that we empowered the grassroots and empowered individuals and people to think for themselves, organize for themselves, engage in critical thinking, and organize with each other on a community level, kind of DIY politics, that's been good. The problem is it's never really developed too well, and in fact it's never stopped this development of the power elite, which was a shame. In some senses, you might have hoped that the things that started to happen in the 1980s would have get people to rethink what the animal movement is all about, and where it needs to go, how it needs to be funded, and where its kind of efforts are going to be kind of concentrated. So I think that to the extent that it happened was a good thing, but it didn't happen very much. And but the real wrong was the development of the power elite within the movement, which is probably larger now than it's ever been, and it also includes, as Ronnie said, the emergent kind of superstars who seem to be counter-revolutionary. The thing that needs to happen more is we need to be critical. We need to start developing a critique of that power elite, and we need to develop empowerment within the movement. And that, for me, is concentrating on empowering the grassroots in any way it needs to get people to be able to think, I can do this. It's not a question of sending a donation. It's not a question of waiting for an order. I can do this. We can do this as a group. Let's get on with it. Let's do it.
Really interesting points. And I don't think any of us would dispute about that last point, though, is to go on and do it, whatever you can do. The top clock's ticking. Whatever you can do.
Yeah, that's right.
All three of us, what's interesting about us, we've all been doing this quite a long time. And we all want to do a lot more. So, if you're new to this, you may well be asking, well, why would that be? And the answer is because we didn't quite do enough when we don't want to be left, or I'll answer that for myself. I don't want to be left thinking we didn't do enough. If we blow this, we don't want to blow it. So just to
come on, young people, get your fingers out. We're all dying here. We want you to rescue the movement. Come on.
Just my little opinion on that is that perhaps what went wrong was the framing. The framing of this whole thing has been a big detrimental problem, I think. The framing. There was reasons for that. There's no blame, really. It's just how it was. It's history now. I think the framing in the 80s, the 90s, this development is just the framing was really what went wrong. The clarity that we have now is really important. The clarity and understanding, I see a lot less conflating, a lot more clarity. And I think that's a result of people talking it through and working it out and paying attention to this. So I think we've done really well with that clarity. I think the danger because I think we've not only got a clarity on ethical veganism, I think we have more clarity now on an intersectional framework. And both of these have been big parts of the last 5 years, especially, and they've involved quite challenging problems. And I think we've got there on both counts. So I feel there's a real clear understanding of the benefits of both ethical veganism and the intersectional framework. Fantastic to move forward to. And I'd say if there is a danger or we need to pay attention to still, is the weaponization of these positions. There's no need, there's no value in beating each other up. We understand these positions, so let's help further that. We really are past the point where we need to weaponize them. I don't think weaponizing them myself has ever really helped, but perhaps there's an argument to be said it has. There's a tension, it's a dynamic. I would say clearly now, weaponization isn't going to help. If you see a problem, fill in the solution. Don't beat someone else up about it. Put in the solutions. It's all about solution-based, collective, being kind, supportive, clarity, working together, doing it yourself, but doing it as a collective. And if that's what I remember about the 80s, it was that fantastic DIY vibe.
DIY, that's it. Well said, young man.
Brave thing, and if there was an analogy, I was just going to wrap up with what I remember about the animal rights scene was proper. That was a punk rock. When a vegan thing came along, I was proper rave. We were all fluffy and rave. It's like, oh yeah, have some of this. It was punk rock. It was all about tear it down, smash it up, and start again. So I see now that we've come through a whole period of history where we're into this new decade now. We've got a real bright future. So let's hope so. I'm going to wrap up on that point. Thank you both very much for your contributions. There is a conversation going on the comment section. I think Ronnie and Roger will both be able to chat further if you're listening. And thank you very much. Thank you, guys, for your contribution. Thank you for all the work you've done. And there's many more days, many more successful campaigns. Ronnie Lee, Roger Yates. Thanks very much.
Yeah,
Thanks,
cheers.
Tim. Thanks, Roger.
Take care. Stay